So it is 12/6/2024. And I cannot wait for 2024 to be over, which is wild because what's awaiting on the other side is 2025, which means Project 2025. It's a whole thing. But hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us at Secular AZ today. Feel free to put your name in the chat and let us know who you are and where you're from and why you are here today. Be sure to switch the blue button at the bottom from host and panelists to everyone so that we can all see your comments. Since we're all looking for positivity these days, let us know. Are there any cool events that are happening in your community this weekend or next? Go ahead and throw it in the chat. Here at Secular AZ, we focus on issues, not parties, but we know which party is chomping at the bit to implement the policies laid out in Project 2025. So no doubt, Secular AZ staff, our legal director, and board of directors will all find ourselves very busy in 2025 and beyond. So today, now that your political giving has probably slowed down, I'm asking each and every one of you to consider becoming a monthly donor today. Without your support, we just can't do this really important work, and it's about to become even more important and probably even more busy for us. Next week, we're going to be speaking with Professor Karen Morrison. She's the professor of law at the Center for Access to Justice at the University of Georgia, and she's going to be discussing her research into pregnancy as a modern form of coverture post-Dobbs. But for today, we are speaking with Professor Matthew Facciani, a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Notre Dame. He is an interdisciplinary social scientist with a background in neuroscience and psychology and a PhD in sociology. His forthcoming book, Misguided, Where Misinformation Starts, How It Spreads, and What to Do About It, will be published by Columbia University Press. Holy cow, is this the most timely discussion? I think the timing of you coming on this show is really perfect because, in my opinion, I feel like the election was lost because of mis and disinformation. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to you, Matthew, and you can, is there anything I missed in your bio, by the way?
No, that all sounds good.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. All right. Take it away, Matthew.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk to you all today. Hopefully I can shed some light on why people believe misinformation and what we could do about it. So that's what I'll be talking about in this talk. And then I'm happy to answer any questions at the end. But the outline of this talk I was thinking is to think about the social psychology behind all this. So my background is interdisciplinary, but I often approach misinformation as a perspective within social psychology and how different social forces can influence us and information processing more broadly. So that's kind of how I think about it. So I'm going to talk about kind of what factors increase vulnerability to misinformation, and then how we can potentially mitigate these forces as well. And then finally end the talk with some discussion of media and information literacy in addition to the social and psychological stuff that I'll be talking about. So to get some background information on how I approach this subject, I wanted to just break down how we define identities, because I think identities are really central to how people process information and misinformation. So how I think about identities is a set of meanings. And these meanings can define us in a variety of ways, such as roles we occupy, social categories we belong to, or even individual characteristics. So you can think of like a student identity or a worker identity where you go and you study or you do your work. Or maybe you belong to a sports team where you meet with your team and play different sports with them. Or maybe you have individual characteristics such as being a skeptical, curious person, and that's how you see yourself. And all of these identities can influence how you interact with your world. And there's a lot of research showing how they can really influence what we believe, how we behave, who we interact with. And importantly, there's this identity feedback loop where we have this motivation to support our important identities. And it really gives us this self-esteem boost. So as long as we're behaving in accordance to these important identities, we feel good about ourselves. So again, you can think about, if we get a good grade as a student, that makes us feel good. If we score the game-winning touchdown for our team, that feels good. Or if we're a curious, skeptical person and we learn something new, this can make us feel good about ourselves, so we're motivated to keep doing this. So in a lot of ways, there's a lot of positives to this identity feedback loop. And it can provide us with a lot of sense of meaning, help us navigate our social worlds more broadly. But one way where it can be causing us issues and being the most evidence-based in how we navigate the worlds that we live in is with political identities, because political identities often motivate us to support our own group and view the world in a way that supports that group that might not be the best representation of reality. So I'm sure, as we're all very aware in the United States, there's a lot of political polarization and political misinformation. Um, when I talk about misinformation, I'm talking about a very broad term here, very broad umbrella, just meaning false or misleading information. Again, how I approach this is really thinking about the biases that influence how we process information. So thinking about politics, we know that political identities bias us to support our own group and attack our out group. And this has a lot of influence for all of us in society. But from a social science perspective, it's also interesting and helpful that there's these very two clearly defined groups in the United States. They have this in-group and out-group that we can study. But when I talk about identities here, even though I'm going to be focusing on political identities here, the processes apply more broadly. It's just, again, it has so much influence, and it's very clear in-group and out-group. So that's what we'll be talking about for this talk. So you've probably seen charts and graphs like this about this growing political polarization. Both Republicans and Democrats are getting further apart in a variety of issues. But I think one of the bigger things to think about is this growing dislike of political outgroups. So as we've seen throughout the last few decades now, Americans are much more likely to dislike the opposing party than they used to. It used to be there's some dislike, but now it's a lot stronger. And this dislike really translates into how Democrats and Republicans view different issues. As we saw with COVID-19, right from the onset, Democrats and Republicans disagreed and differed significantly in how they viewed how serious the virus was. This then impacted vaccination rates, with Republicans being far less likely to get the COVID-19 vaccine. And we're now seeing this even translate to vaccine attitudes more broadly than just COVID. With the election results in 2020, we saw that Republicans were far less likely to think the results were legitimate and accurate in 2020, but now in 2024, they do think it's legitimate and accurate. So you can see that political bias at play there. In fact, one of the few things that Democrats and Republicans agree on is that they can't agree on basic facts. So it's this really strong identity-driven bias of information. And again, I'm talking about this in terms of identity and political identity. But when we think about identities, they're not just these static forces. They interact with a lot of other identities and other social forces, such as our social networks. So I want to take a step to look further in how these identities can influence us. One way to think about this is this term called social identity complexity. And basically all that means is that when you have more important identities that are independent from each other, then you have higher social identity complexity. And this is predictive of a lot of positive things, such as being more open-minded, more tolerant of outgroups. And we have shown that intergroup contact can actually increase social identity complexity. So you have more identities that are important to you that are across many different domains. And then the opposite of that is if you have a lot of overlap between identities, and this would be lower social identity complexity. And the issue with this is whenever you have a small amount of identities and those smaller set of meanings that help you navigate the world, you're much more vulnerable to bias and biased information processing. And importantly, when we think about how identities work together, we know that identities become more important to us when they share meanings with other identities. So there's this reinforcing effect that happens as well. So if you have a smaller set of important identities, they can all become more important to you, and you can view the world through a smaller and smaller lens. So when we think about American politics, we can think of it in terms of too many Americans having lower social identity complexity. This has been referred by some political scientists as having these mega identities that really encompass how we view the world across many different domains. And we could predict so much by someone's politics. So how they view the world across many different issues. And there's so many identities that are predicted by just if someone's a Democrat or Republican, such as their education group or their gender or racial group, although that's becoming more complex lately. But still, our political identities tend to be very predictive of a large array of identities, which can, again, have this connection to a lower social identity complexity. So we can think about our identities in this identity complexity model by seeing really how they are represented spatially. You can actually draw them on like a two-dimensional map. So I want to give some examples of this. So for example, let's say we have our religious identity and our political identity. It doesn't really matter what they are, but we can just pretend that if we draw them on a map, they're really close together. And let's say for this example, they're have 100% overlap, that there's no real disagreement. The church we go to and our politics, they really align basically 100%. So there's no conflict there. And then even, let's say we have a volunteer identity, but we volunteer at our church. And again, it's completely overlapping with our other important identities. And then all of our friends are also at this church and all share our politics. So you can see this being a very small set of meanings that all reinforce each other. And we have so much of our sense of self being derived from this small set of meanings that any information we encounter that threatens that feels very threatening to our sense of self overall. So we have a motivation to believe information that might not be evidence-based if it conflicts with these smaller set of meanings, if it attacks some of these important identities. So then the opposite of that would be a much broader sense of social identity complexity. Let's say we have our political and religious identity again, but they're not really overlapping. They're maybe just connected on a couple different dimensions, and there's a lot of disagreement between them. And then let's say we volunteer at something completely apolitical, like a pet shelter, where it's very different people than in our political and religious groups that we associate with. And then let's say we have friends from maybe joining a sports team or something like that, and it's very different from these other groups. So we're seeing a much broader set of meanings and a broader set of identities that we can derive self-esteem from. And by doing this, we're not so threatened by any one of these identities encountering information that makes them look bad. So let's say something attacks our politics. It doesn't feel like our entire sense of self is being destroyed because our sense of self is so much broader and has this vast landscape of where we can derive self with sense esteem from. So to connect this more directly to political misinformation, again, we know that Democrats, Republicans, or really anyone who belongs to a group, they're motivated to process information that affirms that identity. And some of the research that I've done shows that when people have an even more important identity to them, they are more likely to believe misinformation regarding their political group. But it's not just that these identities intersect with other identities. We can think about how they intersect with our social networks. So we know that we prefer to associate with people like ourselves, which is called homophily. And both Democrats and Republicans have very homogeneous social networks. So if we think about our online networks, these are two graphs looking at Facebook friends of a typical liberal and typical Republican or conservative Facebook profile. The blue dots are liberals, the red dots are conservative friends, and you can probably guess which one is your typical liberal Facebook friend graph versus the conservative Facebook friend. And why this matters, it's not so much that we're seeing a lot of the information that is maybe limiting our scope of information. If we're just seeing like a lot of people share news that aligns with us, that's part of it. But it's also this social impact of this mutual identity verification, where not only are we trying to verify and support our own identity, but then people around us will bolster that process. So if we share something on Facebook, we see people like it and share it and interact with it, and that supports our identity. And then we like and share their things. And there's this feedback loop again on top of that feedback loop that exists just within the identity process itself. So when we think about are these network effects, the type of relationship does matter for this. So shared agreement among our personal network, people we feel close to, it can bolster political beliefs. It can even increase our endorsement of conspiracy theories if we think people close to us also share those beliefs. But if we just have some sort of superficial exposure with the outgroup, this doesn't necessarily reduce that polarization. In fact, it can actually increase polarization, as some studies have shown. So just, interacting with someone on Twitter or Facebook who disagrees with you, that superficial social exposure probably won't reduce polarization. But if we have a more diverse group of people within our close, meaningful ties, this could reduce polarization, or at least have some predictive power on how polarized someone might be. And overall, the closeness of ties is relevant for belief commitment in this identity verification process. So again, people care more about information if they trust where the group it's coming from. So if they trust that group that's giving them the information, they think it's part of their team, then they're more likely to listen to it. So some other research I've done on political networks and beliefs, I did find that whenever people have more shared agreement in their personal network, so who they associate with, this does predict stronger political identity importance, which again, if you have a very strong political identity, you're more likely to have biased information processing. So one of the ways I tested this was having participants, Democrats and Republicans, view political rumors and fake news headlines that aligned with their own political group. Not only did I find this in political rumors and fake news headlines, but I also found that a greater proportion of Democrats in one's network predicted greater support for vaccines, and then a greater proportion of Republicans predicted a lower support of vaccines, both COVID and general vaccines as well. So we're thinking about how identities can influence information processing and networks. One last thing I wanted to add to this was some of the complexity of other identities changing how networks can change over time. One study I did looked at network loss before and after the 2016 election. So this was a very polarizing election, as basically all elections are in the United States these days. And I wanted to see if network loss changed between LGBT adults and their cis hetero counterparts. So I found that everyone in the study was more likely to drop politically different network connections. So people that you listed, that you talk to regularly, your friends and family, if you also listed them as having different politics, you were more likely to not talk to them after the 2016 election. Kinship did protect against this, so people were less likely to drop those ties that were different than them if they were family. There's two ways to think about this. It could be they already cut ties with the most difficult people in their family, or that kinship did actually protect them from being dropped. And then as far as comparing to LGBT adults versus cis hetero adults, we find that LGBT respondents were more likely to lose politically different network connections. So if your rights are being up for debate in politics, you might be more likely to drop someone who has different politics than you. So finally, when we think about identity biases, so far I've been talking about misinformation, this false or misleading information more broadly, but actual disinformation campaigns, this is purposeful false information, can take advantage of these existing identity and network biases. Not only can it make people want to believe things they already want or inclined to believe, but just more broadly, it can sow confusion and undermine trust in information and institutions. And there's been research showing that people who lack status and social support and are isolated are especially vulnerable to extremism and propaganda. So to summarize, this process of identities, networks, and misinformation, identities are very powerful, but they also create a vulnerability for believing misinformation or disinformation. Networks can predict additional bias. If we have a very politically homogeneous network, we might be more likely to want to support those identities that are important to us and have more polarized or extreme beliefs. So greater diversity within networks may help. And there's some techniques that can help improve dialogue between groups, such as connecting with a shared identity. And I can talk more about that if people are interested. But again, this can be difficult for a variety of reasons. Again, if your own another identity that you have is being politically debated, you might not want to associate with people who are disagreeing with one of your identities, for example. So that's the very short overview of the social and psychological factors that influence information processing. I think it's critical to understand those social forces, but we also have to think about education as well. And one big area when we think about biased information in our society that we can think about as a way to reduce that biased information is through media, digital information literacy. So media literacy is a very broad term. It includes a variety of things, such as what you see on this screen here, such as avoiding scams and cross-checking news. And generally, it's just the ability to critically evaluate media and information. Some other examples, verifying the credibility of a source, identifying manipulation techniques, and again, reflecting on our own biases as part of that as well. And people who have these higher media literacy levels are better able to discern true versus false headlines. There's a lot of studies showing that it does help in having more evidence-based processing. And a lot of people think they're better at detecting fake news headlines than their accuracy scores actually indicate. So there's a lot of room for improvement here. And we know that you can teach these skills pretty effectively if you actually get people into a classroom and have them take a course on how to critically evaluate media. They're less vulnerable to misinformation and false headlines. But of course, this is resource intensive. Not everyone can take, a several month course at a college. So researchers have been developing these pre-bunking games. So instead of debunking false information after the fact, there's this idea if you can pre-bunk people and teach them how to recognize manipulation techniques ahead of time, then they're actually better able to identify misinformation when they encounter it. There's a variety of these games that have been established. This is one of the most studied ones. It's called the bad news game. And basically, you just try to create chaos from spreading fake news in the game and get as many followers as you can. And as you do this, you learn about different techniques. And you get these badges, such as learning how to use emotion and polarization to rile up your supporters. There's also Breaking Harmony Square, which is another short online game where, again, you're trying to sow chaos as this chief disinformation officer, and you get more points as you cause more chaos, and you learn about different techniques to do that and things to look out for. So again, looking for like really emotional language in different posts is one thing that you learn through playing the game, and then you can be more aware of that when you encounter headlines after you play the game. We actually developed our own pre-bunking game at Notre Dame. It's called Gali Fakta, and basically means fact game or dig up the facts in Indonesia. So it's designed for an Indonesian audience. So a lot of these media literacy games were designed and developed by Western English-speaking research groups and are for these Western English-speaking populations. So we wanted to create a media literacy game that connected with a very large country, the fourth largest country in the world. And it also has a different spin than some of these other popular games. Instead of just learning about misinformation by spreading chaos, we took it from the perspective of trying to protect your friends and family in a WhatsApp group. So WhatsApp is very popular in Indonesia, Southeast Asia. So you're interacting with these fake friends and family in the game, and basically they send you these rumors or fake news articles, And they ask you, do you think this is true? Why or why not? Here's an example of someone who's worried about this tiger running around Jakarta, and they ask you if you think it's true, and you can click on it and it gives you some more details about it. And basically you see that the information only cites rumors. It doesn't have any official sources or research. And even the image is this old image that isn't even in the city. So then you could say, no, this is a hoax. There's no good evidence for it. And you get points that way. And we found that people who played this game were better able to detect false news headlines afterwards. So it seems to be pretty effective as well. Not only are there pre-bunking games, a new wave of research is looking at using AI chatbots. One recent study looked at using these chatbots to help debunk conspiracy theories. So basically, they had people who said they believed in at least one conspiracy theory interact with this ChatGPT-like chatbot over a series of 3 separate dialogues. And basically, the person states their conspiracy theory, and the chatbot will poke holes in their logic and just point to flaws in their reasoning and ask them to explain the mechanism of why they believe that. And the researchers found that after people interact with this AI chatbot, they realize that there's some holes in their argument and actually decrease the strength of belief in their conspiracy theory by about 20%. So a lot of interesting work in this area trying to make scalable solutions to boosting media literacy. For the last few minutes of my talk, I just wanted to give some very quick media literacy tips that you might find useful or you might want to share with some of your friends and family. The first one's called lateral reading. So this is what a lot of professional fact checkers do. Basically, instead of looking within the contents of the article just vertically, you look horizontally and you look how you compare things within the article to other sources. So, for example, you see who is the author and what motives might have. Do they have any biases? Who's funding them? Who's funding the site that they published the article on? What do other people say about this website or that article? And then who do you think the target audience might be? And again, is there kind of any agenda behind this? So you're not just looking at if the facts have been verified by other sources, but you're looking at this broader bias within the content, and then looking at that what other people see and evaluate across a variety of sources. There's also different charts like this that look at media bias. This is the ad fonts media chart. Again, it's just a general tool, but it can help you give some understanding of if something is more reliable or not, and if it's more left-leaning or more right-leaning. So again, a general tool to helpful. And this is a nonpartisan group where they have a variety of people evaluate these. Another tool that I like is called Ground News. This tells you just if right-leaning or left-leaning sources are talking more about a particular headline, and it gives you the breakdown of the percentage, so you can see if it's more skewed in one ecosystem or the other. And also, I think if you pay for it, it tells you the funding sources that you can look up as well of all of the news organizations they list. And then there's a bunch of news literacy resources out there. One is called the News Literacy Project, and again, another nonpartisan resource, and they have a ton of tips for how to evaluate vetting a news source, for example, or even now looking at AI. There's Pointer, which is connected to the International Fact-Checking Network, and a lot of these resources help you identify what journalistic practices should you look out for when you're evaluating if a media source is reputable or not. So in summary, identities and network effects are very powerful and can also create a vulnerability for believing misinformation. One way to combat this is to increase the diversity within our networks, but this can be really tricky. So more broadly, I think it's important for people to identify their own social identity maps. And again, when we think about that term social identity complexity, kind of think about our own social identity complexity, what that looks like, and try to increase our literacy within that domain. So not just media literacy, which is very helpful, but also thinking about where we're deriving our self-esteem from with our social identities and how that could play a role in how we process information. So again, combine that social and psychological understanding with some of these media literacy tips as well. So in the future, my research is going to continue to develop and improve these different media literacy tools for different populations. I'm also interested in how people interact with AI chatbots, such as ChatGPT. And since AI is taking over in so many ways and becoming so much more influential, I really want to try to understand how people not only interact with AI, but develop AI literacy training and intervention. So one thing that we've been working on is trying to teach people how to recognize manipulated images, for example. And we've shown that we have been able to do that with a current study we're doing. Finally, I do have a book coming out. It's called Misguided, Where Misinformation Starts, How It Spreads, and What's to Do About It. It's published with Columbia University Press and should be out soon in the next year. It just was published on their website, so it's in the works. We're just kind of finalizing the final formatting and such. And it's all about how identities, networks, and their intersection explain our susceptibility to misinformation. I also talk a lot about health misinformation and COVID-19 and vaccines, as well as talking about media literacy as well. So kind of got a short overview of this talk, and I go into a lot more detail in my book. If you have questions, feel free to find me on social media. I'm most active on Threads, Blue Sky, and Instagram, or you can look on my website. And then I do have a podcast coming out next year where I'm going to be talking about misinformation in a variety of forms. If you're interested in supporting that, you can look at my newsletter on Substack. Right now, since my book is not officially available for pre-order, if you sign up to be an annual paid subscriber on my newsletter, I'm going to give you a free signed copy of my book as soon as they're available. So if you're interested in that, the QR code connects directly to my newsletter. So thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to answering any questions you have.
That's a pretty great deal. I've been trying to support more Substack writers. You know, we have a really great publication here called the Arizona Agenda. And it was a couple of journalists who, you know, local news is dying, you know, and more and more journalists are being laid off, and, you know, editors won't let you publish the stories that you really want to, right? So they've done a great job of you know, sharing accurate, balanced news about what's going on, mostly at our state legislature, but in other areas as well. So that is a great deal for everybody to sign up for your Substack to get a free signed copy of your book. I'm definitely going to be doing that for sure.
Oh, thank you so much.
I wish I had asked beforehand if you could perhaps have shared a copy with me, but that's okay because your discussion today was really great. And I have some questions first from the chat.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you might be able to answer this one, but somebody in the chat asked if homeschooling is more likely to lock a person into their very narrow identities.
Oh, that's a tough question. I don't, off the top of my head, I don't know studies I've looked at that. So I could only say within the framework that I've outlined, it could, right? Like if you're homeschooling entails you only, you know, staying at home and not interacting with other kids with different ideas, then I think it could create that narrow set of identities. So I mean that when we think about education more broadly, it's not just that people when they go to college they're learning new ideas and like learning new stuff. It's they're meeting lots of different people, and I think that kind of expands people's minds in a lot of ways more than the actual or just as much as the education itself.
We've had several ex-evangelicals on our program on Fridays, and many of them cite, even if they go to like a Christian university, just being, going oftentimes from homeschooling or religious education to then just being on a much larger campus, different people, different ideas, right? But they cite that first kind of foray into the secular world as their as the turning point for them. Let's see. There was another question from the chat. I wrote them down, but usually I have another screen. Today I'm not at home, so it's a little bit of a challenge for me. Hold on just a second. Okay. Okay. Have you studied any of the ways, this one comes from Greg, have you studied any of the ways that changes in the workplace have impacted the shrinking networks people have experienced? He says work from home versus the office, corporate policies, limiting topics of conversation. So, with so many people transitioning to working from home, do you think that that has impacted the shrinking networks people have experienced?
Yeah, I would say probably. And again, I don't know data off the top of my head. So um, the there's a lot of discussion of this concept of the third place that you might have heard of. It's like your first place is your home, your second place is work, and then there's really not like a lot of third spaces in America. Whereas other countries, there's like a lot of coffee shops, a lot of parks that are really a lot more accessible where people can meet other people. And I think that's one of the big issues when we think broader, like sociologically, macro level, the way the United States is structured is so often we go home or we go to work, or if we work from home, then we just stay at home and we don't have an opportunity to meet lots of different people and expand our social identity map. And I think that plays a big role in not just of our social identity map, but also isolation and loneliness, which are other factors for believing propaganda and extremism. So a lot of it is interconnected for sure.
Another question is from Julie. Thank you for your service, Julie. She's an outgoing board member in the Scottsdale School District. And thanks for running for county supervisor as well. She asks, these media literacy debunking games are interesting, but a participant would have to be suspect of fact literacy to begin with in order to participate, right?
Yeah, I mean that's one of the big limitations. So even like that chatbot study, they talk about that in their discussion section. It's like, well, the people that signed up for this study who believed in these conspiracy theories were at least open enough to sign up for this research study. So there might be some people that may not even want to engage with any media literacy tool, and that's always going to be a challenge for sure.
There we go. Okay. Phil asks, even if we could eliminate mis and disinformation, do you feel it would make a difference in people's social identity and how they behave and vote?
Well, so that's one of the big issues is people who have these identities are motivated to protect them, right? So it's not even so much that they're being misled sometimes. They might actually just really want to support a policy or a politician. And I think that's important as well for everyone to grapple with. But especially with Democrats with this last election, I think it's important to realize that there are just a lot of people who think very differently. And they're motivated to process the world in a way that maybe we don't, if we're on one side or the other. So just trying to understand where people are coming from, and have productive conversations. I can talk more about that as well. I actually just wrote about that. So my newsletter, I've been trying to be more active on it. And I have these 5 tips for having more productive political conversations. I also talk about that more in my book in a lot more depth. But I think that'd be helpful. And I know there's challenges to doing that, but I think it would help.
And Roger asks, how do we look into our own identities? Do you have book or website suggestions? I'm pretty sure that if you went, Roger, to his Substack and then subscribed, and then you'll get his book, I think that's probably a good start. But do you have any other recommendations, Matthew?
I do. There is this book. I think its name is Peter Coleman. Yeah. So he looks at this with his research as well. He's out of Columbia University. Let's see. Yeah, his book was Depolarizing America, Ending Toxic Polarization. He actually talks about social identity complexity and has some website resources as well. Let's see if I can find it. I cite him. Let's see, I found it. Okay. Yeah. So he actually has like the exercise that I use is mapping out your oh, okay, you found it too. Yeah, but he gives some strategies to help that. And again, like people have to have the motivation to want to look inward, which is always the challenge. But if we do, and we can kind of create norms where more people find this acceptable or encouraged, then I think that could hopefully spread to other people as well.
And this goes right along with that. This comes from Eddie, who's our development director. Please make Eddie happy and donate lots of money, everybody. He asks, what is your recommendation on bringing folks in gently to share that what they are sharing or believing is fake news? I feel oftentimes people feel defensive or ridiculed. I see that online a lot.
Yeah. So, I mean, online discussion is so challenging. And I think it's mostly unproductive, to be honest. I just think your time could be better spent elsewhere, trying to reach people. Because a lot of times, like, people go online to like vent and like process their own identities and emotions. They're not there to reflect on broader political points a lot of times. It's entertainment, right? So like they're not really going there to open their minds, and it doesn't incentivize that in a lot of ways. So like I said, I mentioned that those 5 steps I offer, which talk about trying to relate to different identities and trying to address your perspective that in a way that aligns with some of the things they care about. Try to promote more thoughtful discussion, such as asking how they derive to a certain conclusion instead of just asking why. So really focusing on like the mechanism. Um, so so much of it is not about even changing. Like I don't like I mentioned in that post, I don't come this at the point of changing people's minds. I never think about that. I think more about reducing polarization and kind of turning down the temperature so people are not so hyped up and extreme in their own identities.
Yeah. This one's coming from Jay. He says, do you know or imagine an increasing number of lawsuits and litigation associated with disinformation?
Yeah, I mean, I'm familiar with some of them. I haven't read like the legal briefs, just kind of summaries of them. But I think the Supreme Court in most recently did upheld some protections to people who study misinformation to be able to communicate their findings with the government and social media. Um, but again, it's kind of outside my area as far as the legal aspects of it. But like there's so much misinformation about misinformation researchers. Like I certainly don't want to censor anyone or tell anyone what to believe. But unfortunately, the word has been so politicized. Just the word misinformation is kind of has this very emotional bent. But the people I know don't want to censor anyone, and I certainly don't either.
We definitely live in strange times.
Mhm.
Alex is asking, are there data on which identities are more or less vulnerable to misinformation?
So I guess like political identities or any identities, you know, I think we're all pretty vulnerable in some ways. I'm not sure I would say even among Democrats and Republicans, if you look at the individual level, at least the data that I've shown and have worked on, I give these like examples for both Democrats and Republicans. That are biased in a way that supports the group, and both sides do have this motivation to protect their identities and process those headlines in a way that's consistent with their identities. I will say that on the leadership of the Democrat Party and the Republican Party, there is research on Republicans being more likely to share low quality news sources on Twitter. There's a few different studies I've looked at this. So like on a top down level, we see that there's again like these news sites that have less journalistic standards, for examples, or just blog posts even. those are more likely to be shared by one political party than the other. Um, and, that's the current environment. So maybe that will change in the future. Who knows?
Yeah. Um, I had a question there. Well, I wanted to address the previous question about, are there more lawsuits? I mean, I'm just thinking of like Alex Jones. You love to see it, right? We had a county recorder here who filed a lawsuit against Carrie Lake, defamation lawsuit. So I do believe that these people do get themselves in legal trouble, but I don't necessarily, I mean, I'm just like, these are anecdotes, right? But the other thing I wanted to say is I don't remember what country, I don't know if it was a Nordic country, if it was Australia or New Zealand, but they are now like nationwide. Maybe it's Finland. Nationwide, it's now a standard for their K-12 schools, right? Like that
Media literacy, right?
Yeah, media literacy. And here in Arizona, last legislative session, we had an outgoing representative from the Tempe area, Juan Mendez, who had a bill that would have, added that to our list of standards, a media literacy course, and it was so interesting to like see this committee hearing. This is such a great idea. Not only would it keep kids safer, right? Like, keep them away from predators, but it would also help them to be better, better at spotting mis and disinformation.
Right.
And of course, it lost on party lines, so there are attempts to do this kind of stuff right here in our own backyard, but the other side doesn't really want there to be media literacy. I think they kind of like that people are not informed.
It's really unfortunate. It should be bipartisan and nonpartisan to increase media literacy skills and just empower citizens to be able to navigate media information systems better. I think hopefully everyone should be on board with that, but unfortunately, once something becomes politicized, it's very tough to get through.
It's very frustrating for sure. John asks, do you think that the conservative MAGA group, white Christian nationalists, conspiracy theorists, etc., actually have any interest at all in bridging the polarization, understanding the liberal side? My impression is that the MAGA group, yes, the broad stroke I realize, is focused only on attacking, not on bringing together opponents as Americans. My impression is that the bringing together is mostly a liberal belief and effort. So let's see what the question was there. Do you think that these conservative groups have any interest in bridging this polarization and understanding the liberal side?
I mean, I think liberals, when you look at personality scales, liberals tend to be more open in approaching diverse ideas. Whereas conservatives, I mean, just the idea of conservative being more conservative, right? So you kind of more having a narrower set of what kind of interactions you want to have. But I do think there are a lot of people you can reach. It's just trying to find those folks, and then hopefully they can talk to other people more on their side. When people are really extreme, it's really hard to reach them no matter what you do. Like if they're really into, like I mentioned that identity map, like if all of their identities are completely overlapping each other, then of course they're not going to want to listen to what you have to say. And they are unreachable in a lot of ways, unfortunately. And I think there's a tendency where, you know, we we don't only want to focus on just the Republicans because we're all vulnerable to doing this. I mean, I definitely see people on the left having their own echo chambers and are very unreachable and being open to new information as well. So I I'm hesitant to blame one side of people. I think it's okay to talk about that in terms of what politicians are saying, but as far as humans, as far as just our American citizens, I think we can reach them. I reach a lot more of them than you might think. So I think it's worth trying as we navigate these uncertain times.
I do find it really interesting, during the election, of course, there are like, man on the street interviews and things like that. And there, I saw several interviews of people who supported Trump either in 2016 or 2020 or both. who now have completely gone the other way, you know.
Hmm.
So it is possible, I think, but probably not with like the QAnon shaman, right? Or
Sure. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, so that's again, when I talk about like trying to reduce polarization, trying to have productive dialogue, it is important to pick your battles and, save your resources for people who are more interested. But I mean, I've had productive conversations with people who voted for Trump. I'm not a Trump supporter, but I can try to connect with what we have in common. And I think with Trump, another thing I think is important to note, just politics more broadly. A lot of people that vote for politicians are what's called low information voters. Like they don't really even know all of the policies or all of the things one politician said or another. They might have just saw Trump on a podcast and thought he was kind of funny, and that's why they voted for him. So I think it's really important to think about the really broad level of people who live in this country and also who vote for one side or the other. A lot of them may not be really ideologically aligned or really extreme in their beliefs. So important to remember that too.
Yeah, agreed. Um, let's see. Here's a comment from Julie. Manipulation is the end game of misinformation and will continue as long as greed and power are fed as a result. I appreciate the interest of this topic as an important research effort and look forward to learning more in the future. So kudos to the work that you do. I was going to say something about, oh, we've had several speakers on this program throughout the years that I've been here. And, because of the nature of our work, Secular AZ, many of them are ex-evangelicals, right? But
Mhm.
like in my experience, because, people know who I am with this organization and I write a Substack for us as well. And so I attend a lot of school board meetings and I see some of these like ultra conservative evangelicals and
Mhm.
the way that some of them like behave towards me, and then what they write about me online, I have to
Mhm.
remember they think I'm literally possessed by demons. They think that
Yeah.
the devil is in me. And so when you have that far extreme beliefs and don't even think that I'm a human being, but some kind
Right.
of like lizard person that drinks adrenochrome or whatever, like we're just never probably gonna have a conversation. So
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah, and again, like if they actually got to know you, like, so many instances, it's like it's fascinating also even looking at online discussion and how mean people could be online. And then even if you like you go on a podcast or do like something audio or you can even just hear someone's voice, like the temperature is really turned down. Um, so, if we can try to connect with more people and really be more active in our communities and meet a diverse set of people, I think that'd be helpful, um, for sure.
I agree. I saw an ad for, oh God, it's like some ad because it's hard to make friends when you're an adult, and especially
Hmm.
maybe if like you move to a new city and it's like
Right.
this app where you can join and then you can just meet random people based on similar interests. I don't know how much they get into like politics or anything, but things like that I think would be a good step for us to get outside of our comfort zones and have those kinds of conversations with more diverse groups of people instead of being in our own echo chamber. Do you have any other like suggestions for how we can maybe like just try to strike up conversations that aren't online, or like are there groups that you might recommend that folks join so they can have more diverse opinions?
Yeah. So yeah, there's definitely like meetup groups and apps for that. One of my favorite things I think that we have here is in this we have sports. I think sports is actually one of the best examples of this because it cuts across party lines. Um, and like you can have very positive associations with people before politics even comes up, and it might never come up. And then you have that like built-in diversity in your networks with something that spans across, a lot of different people. So sports, it'd be great if like, there was some community events that would get more people together. That's again like a macro level thing we need to invest in. So hopefully we could try to invest in these third spaces. But sports is one way that I think is diverse because like even if you think about like book clubs, you might just be talking to people who agree with you already. So there might be some diversity there, but trying to think about broader groups and connect with people that way is one suggestion I have.
I it's interesting that you bring up sports because I was just talking to somebody like after the election or even before the election, but just how sports, like I think a lot of people think of like politics now as sports. Like
Hmm.
they're committed to one team,
Right.
right? And they will not root for the other team. And it becomes more like it's like a competition instead of
Hmm.
like what's actually best. Nobody's really looking into like maybe the policies or the issues that the candidate or the party that they support believe in. But they're like rah rah rah, and like with all the merchandise, right,
Hmm.
coming from both
Right.
sides of the aisle,
Yeah. Hmm.
it feels like you're rooting for a team.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like that's my whole point with the identities. Like you could do the same thing with, and there's been research on this. Like people are really biased to support their sports team, right? I mean, like you could just watch sports when there's a penalty against your team, like, oh, it was a terrible call. And then when it's against the other team, you're like, oh, they did a good job. So, it's
Right.
the same thing, same psychological process, unfortunately, with politics. But politics has a lot more impact on our lives. So hopefully we can get more people more evidence-based in how they think about stuff.
Agreed. Well, there are two people here. Ian, our vice chair of the board, has now become a paid subscriber, just
Oh,
waiting for that
wow.
signed
Thank you
book.
so much.
And
Yeah, of course.
and Julie also signed up for the Substack as a paid subscriber.
Thank
So
you.
I'm really glad that this has worked out so that you have new subscribers. And I'll get to it later on today after I'm done dealing with everything else. Let's see, there's a comment here, board games, BOARD games. Okay, it's not the same thing, but it is something that brings people together. And okay, that's what he's
Yeah, for
saying.
sure.
Perhaps if we did some gaming together, that could be, well, and that brings up another great point, right? A lot of these young men get radicalized
Hmm.
while they're playing games. My
Hmm.
son is a gamer, and my friend's son is a recovering gamer because he left because he got so sick and tired of the constant, like, really racist and misogynist stuff that people say on online gaming. So it's
Hmm.
interesting you bring up games.
Yeah.
Um, I want to close this out today. I typically ask our guests because we are in the worst timeline, if you
Yeah.
ask me. So I always ask our guests at the end of our discussion, what gives you hope, Matthew?
Yeah, it is a difficult time for sure. I'm always encouraged by individuals trying to do the right thing. It's easy to think about all of the bad stuff happening and all the bad people and all of the corrupt people doing bad things. But that negativity bias prevents us from seeing so many great people. Like, everyone at your organization is trying to make such a positive difference in your state and in the country. And, there's lots of great people doing really important work. And as we look throughout history, there's been, a nonlinear progression in many ways, right? Like there's bumps in the road as we try to have a more civilized society. And I guess for me, I also think about just the history of humans. Like it really wasn't that long ago when we were just like, burning witches at the stake and stuff, right? Like that was only a few hundred years ago. We were doing this really crazy stuff. So we're very new to this idea of like having a civilized, enlightened society. And what gives me hope is that because that's so recent of an idea that we have like this interconnected network of people trying to strive for that now, that I think we're pushing in that direction, despite the bumps that we have along the road.
Well, this has been a really great, really relevant discussion. You have two more subscribers
Oh, wow.
based
Thank
on
you
the
guys so
chat.
much. I really
So that
appreciate
is,
that.
I'm so glad we're able to like monetize this discussion for you. I mean, we are in a capitalistic society after all. So I just appreciate you so much, Matthew, for joining us today. It has been my absolute pleasure, and I can't wait to sign up for your Substack. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Whatever holiday you celebrate coming up, I hope you enjoy that too. And I hope everybody else does too.
Thank you so much. It was so great talking with all of you today.
Great talking to you as well. Have a great weekend, everybody, and we'll see you next Friday.